you mentioned you're the CEO, you have this product, Redwood SDK. We've talked to a lot of people who are building products around open source tooling and open source software, and there is some fundamental tension with like working a lot in open source and trying to have a monetizable product. And I'm curious, like, what your vision of like Redwood the business is. Still want to talk about the framework and maybe give people more context about what we're talking about, but it's still interesting to hear. It's like, how do you think about like balancing open source and, bringing in revenue?
I think that's totally fair. The thing is that sometimes what happens is it's like a bit of a rug pull. People will build an open source project and then you'll figure out how they monetize it much later once you've invested all your time into it, and that it just doesn't resonate with maybe the ideals of the project that you were invested in. And if you have a look at Redwood SDK's website, we have this idea called personal software. And we're trying to sort of create a movement around an alternative way of building software, which is really software that you build for yourself, your friends, or your family to scratch an itch. That isn't necessarily about building a brand or figuring out a monetization strategy or raising VC funds. And our tagline is actually, this could be the start of something small. So with all that I just said, we're kind of like, we're encouraging people to build software using our open source tool that doesn't have a monetization strategy and isn't necessarily something that they shouldn't necessarily go raise VC funds. And we got money from Tom Preston Warner and Preston Warner Ventures, and we're building Redwood SDK using his money. So the monetization strategy that we have right now is we're going to build a store for source code so that if you build something useful and people like it, and you don't necessarily want to come up with a brand or a monetization strategy or want to support it, you can just sell that source code on our store. People will pay you a yearly license. They'll get access to the code. They can modify it themselves, and then they can run it in their own personal Cloudflare instance. And that's sort of where we are right now. We're trying to, I like to think of it as Steam for source code. Yeah. Let's see how that goes. It's an interesting concept.
That's super fascinating. Maybe before we like go further, let's just like dig into Redwood. So Redwood started as Redwood JS. So can you give us a little bit more context about like technically like how Redwood JS was shaped and sort of like what its ideas were?
Yeah. So really it started off with a tweet, like all good frameworks should. Tom shared a tweet by the Netlify team where they had this new ability to kind of like drag and drop a GitHub repo onto a page, and that would automatically boot up a website in Netlify's infrastructure. So when I saw that, I said to Tom, "That's really cool. It's such a cool. It reminds me of the old days where we could like FTP a PHP file onto web server, and then you have like something live." And that was backed up by a technology called Lambdas by AWS. And we thought it would be really great if we built on top of that infrastructure. In the 5 years since we've launched Redwood JS, I don't think that Lambdas have changed at all. They've changed very, very little. They haven't improved. And it was our assumption was that this technology will get better over time. So we created a mono repo. Inside that mono repo, we gave you a server side and we gave you a client side. And then the one we'd ship to the CDN, a Netlify CDN, and the other we would ship to an AWS Lambda. And we very quickly ran into a lot of problems with that. The first one being that the moment you wanted data, you needed a connection to a database. And because there were Lambdas, they would spin up, a new one would spin up for every request. And you'd get into connection pool errors, and there was latency errors and cold start errors. And I think we were too early for what we wanted to build. And the difference is with Redwood SDK, we decided to go all in on the request response model. So we went back to the server, and I wanted to find a platform that included everything you need to build software. So I really wanted you to focus just on the software you want to build rather than the infrastructure that you hosted it on. So I went looking around for a platform that could do that. My number one requirement was that it was worldwide. So I'm in South Africa. If I'm building software for my friends, I want it to be fast for people around here or my community. And I want the same to be true for you in New York. And I want it to be free as well. I wanted you to be able to try it without having to pay, because you might not actually have access to a credit card. I think of myself being an ambitious teenager trying to get things on the internet. And back then I could. There was just like free PHP servers where you could host things. And I'm sure I remember there was something like that for Node in the early days, Ninjitsu or something like that, if I remember correctly. But I don't think that exists anymore. And you're kind of out $20 if you want to host something, and then you need a database, and then you're out another $20. Um, so my idea was, let's find a host. I found Cloudflare. They had, I think, like 330 nodes all over the world. You don't need a credit card to use them. And they just happen to include like a database, queues, file storage, like practically everything you need to build software, the fundamental parts, and then like lots of bells and whistles. So we prototyped on Cloudflare for about a month. And I'm sort of hyper cautious of technology. Usually you get upsides, and the upsides always produce downsides. And with Cloudflare, I haven't found them yet. And I know that sounds ridiculous, and I'm sure they exist, but it is a really, really good platform. So the separation between Redwood JS and Redwood SDK couldn't be further. The one is purely server side. It gives you server side rendering with React Server components and client components, and then it gives you access to the Cloudflare platform with database storage, queues, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I first heard, or not heard about Redwood, I guess, but was made aware of it by my friend Orta Therox, who I worked with at Artsy. And Redwood JS had an architecture that was very similar to how we built things at Artsy. So React, GraphQL. Orta's a big fan of Relay, so like Relay was pretty much regularly in the mix. And this is like how I thought about web architecture a lot, and there was like a lot of products being built at the time like that. And then seeing Redwood SDK, with server components being very closely tied to Cloudflare deployments, and it does seem like the overall architecture in some ways has gotten a lot simpler. What were the lessons that led from one to the other? Were there like particular like complexities and pain point? Like, why not keep using GraphQL? Like, why just lean into React Server components? What are the implications? Like, how did you get here?
Yeah, so we have a couple of principles that we invoked when we wanted to build Redwood SDK. But the first thing that I really think about as a developer today is that a lot of what we do is we share memory from one computer to another in a safe way. And every layer you introduce, when you're doing that, adds a layer of complexity. All of a sudden, you need to authenticate in this particular layer. If you think about it, your database is a computer that has memory in it. You need to authenticate against that. Then you include GraphQL or an ORM. Then you include GraphQL, and then you include some kind of HTTP transport. And each one of those has like its own abstraction that allows you to share memory securely. Those abstractions add up, and at the end of the day, it feels like you're not actually coding on the web anymore. You can't actually really fundamentally understand how things are going over the wire. And I think it just makes the experience a lot worse. So with Redwood SDK, it's request and response. It's fetch all the way through. And Cloudflare has this concept called bindings. So a database is accessible to your worker through a variable, and it feels like they're on the same machine. So it feels like you're not sharing memory over the network. You're just saying, "Hey, give me this stuff in the database." That gives you sort of like it. It also makes building software much simpler because we're using the browser as the framework. Like we're using form data, request and response, streaming responses, upgrading fetch requests to WebSockets, etc. And it just works really well. Like that, the people who architected the net really knew what they're doing. They still know what they're doing. They've designed something that's incredibly elegant. And I think that we have abstracted too much of that away in the way that we approach building websites today. So I have this thing that I say the browser is the framework and the network is the framework. If you understand the fundamental request/response cycle, you can build anything very quickly and it will be really easy to reason about. So that's the number one. We wanted to focus on fundamentals. Number two was we wanted to remove magic. So when you give a framework developer a transpiler, they're going to invent some fancy syntax because they're like, hey, here's a nice way to like remove some boilerplate. If you export things or like you include some named exports, we will know what to do with that in a special way. But all of a sudden you start breaking the contract of TypeScript or JavaScript. You're no longer importing and exporting explicitly. You're doing it implicitly, so you can't follow the flow. Somehow those things appear on the page like as if it were magic. And then you have to figure out how to type those things in those magic gaps. So you have a client-side component and you have a server-side component or function. And you're like, how the types work together? Then we invent TRPC or something along the lines that just gives us the typings. With Redwood SDK, you import the function, it's typed. In the client component, it's typed. We're just leveraging TypeScript. So I wanted to remove all the magic. I wanted you to feel like you were coding in TypeScript. And then the third thing was we really integrated a lot of packages with Redwood JS. We had Storybook and Jest, and we had all this magic around how they were working, and we invented our own syntax. So we made sure that syntax worked in Storybook and Jest, and it made things really difficult to maintain. Upgrades were a nightmare for the team, and things just slowed down. We couldn't move as fast as we wanted. With Redwood SDK, we're not doing that. We're just a Vite plugin. Everything is stock standard. And if you want to integrate something, we'll provide a really, really good guide on how to do that. And maybe your AI can figure that out for you. But we want to put the power in your hands so that you don't feel locked into our platform either. So I've said this a couple of times to myself. I'm really surprised with what we've produced. It feels incredibly elegant to me. And I do not know why other frameworks aren't like this. I don't know why it took so long to get here. But I have this, I thought about this, and there's this picture of these SpaceX rockets. You've got that Raptor version 1, Raptor version 2 and 3. And every iteration, they get simpler, but they're doing the same thing. And I feel like that's kind of what happened with here. I've been able to build a framework twice in my life. I don't think that's something that a lot of people get an opportunity to do. And the second time round, I've learned some lessons, and I've brought them to the table.